Welcome to this afternoon's plenary session, Teachers College, the Next Generation. And what an exciting and inspiring generation it is. The four faculty members you'll hear from this afternoon are creating new fields of innovation and inquiry and applying that knowledge in real time to make a difference. This is TC's enduring tradition. When the college's first dean, James Earl Russell, envisioned this college, he said he wanted training which would enable the student to see the relationships existing everywhere in the various fields of knowledge, even the unity of all knowledge. And he could have been talking about the work at TC today. TC has charted new frontiers in education, culture, and society at every step of the way in our 125 years of existence. Are the lengthy lists of TC firsts is testament to this. So every time I do them, I try to do them without looking. But educational psychology, urban education, gifted education, conflict resolution, international and comparative education, arts education, nursing education, special education, and there are undoubtedly more. We were the first to expand the breadth of a school of education to include courses on nutrition, psychology, nursing, and other fields not traditionally associated with teacher preparation. Today, we're creating a new legacy of firsts with a distinct 21st century twist. For example, we are uniquely positioned to take advantage of anticipated major breakthroughs in cognitive science, neuroscience, and technology that will transform education as we know it. To borrow language from Star Trek, perhaps the human mind is our final frontier of discovery. There's so much promising and potentially groundbreaking work in these fields taking place right now and taking place right here at TC, as you'll hear from Karen Froud. Karen founded and directs TC's Neurocognition of Language Lab. The lab is a state-of-the-art facility that uses high-density electroencephalography to investigate questions about language cognition and learning across the lifespan. She uses the EEG technology to understand how brain differences shape our behavior. Today, Karen will demonstrate research with one of the lab's high-density EEG systems. It's a fascinating glimpse of how rapid brain processes unfold and are measured in real time, with the goal to learn more about how individuals respond to particular stimuli. Gaining a deeper understanding of how people learn through research like Karen's will have an impact on how we teach the next generation. In fact, this has been called the century of the learner, a new era where the focus will be on learners of all ages acquiring the knowledge and skills they need to be creative, productive citizens throughout their lives and tailoring instruction to the needs and capabilities of each student. Also developing an entirely new field of inquiry in a TC way is Lisa Miller, director of our clinical psychology program, whose research explores the connection between what we know about how the mind works and spirituality, and how that connection can be translated into improving the lives of individuals and communities. Lisa was instrumental in creating the Ivy League's first master's degree concentration in spirituality and psychology, as well as TC's Spirituality and Mind-Body Institute. Her work has real-world impact in our communities in settings like Covenant House, where she and her students are helping to address the psychological, psychiatric, and educational needs of the city's more than 12,000 homeless youth. This kind of real-world impact is very important to our next speaker, Chris Emdin, an assistant professor of science education who uses elements of hip-hop, such as rap, to engage high school students in science and keep them in school. Chris is working to combat the high dropout rate of students and to make science appealing to the too many students who say they don't like the subject, don't understand why they need to learn it, and can't imagine themselves as scientists. His Science Genius Battles curriculum, BATTLES, curriculum is being piloted in 10 New York City public high schools. Chris's TC students are working with students in the pilot schools to prepare for an end-of-the-semester science rap competition. Our fourth speaker, Joey Lee, who teaches in our technology and education program, is catching the wave of gamification in learning, applying the new learning research we're engaged in to a popular form of youth entertainment. Joey's research explores how we can harness the power and prevalence of games and game principles to address some of our biggest challenges, such as how we might more effectively engage students and improve learning, especially in the STEM disciplines, and better prepare learners everywhere to succeed in the digital age. His work involves development and testing of digital learning games for classrooms and effective tools for teachers to guide and reward students. While he focuses on student learning, he also considers how games help us tackle complex global issues like climate change, once again applying new knowledge to real-world issues in a very TC way. So TC faculty are continually at the forefront, developing novel ways to engage students based on how they learn, create, and problem solve in the real world. At TC, an important example of our success in having an impact on schools and communities and the lives of people is in Harlem, our new Teachers College Community School. It's a great example of how we can see positive results for children and communities through a close university-school partnership. Just imagine the improvement we would see in public education if every university worked in concert with local schools and communities. TC's work in communities cuts across fields, just as it does on campus, to encompass arts, health, and human services. TC is so fortunate to have a forward-looking faculty who will help us create future firsts for our next 125 years. It's my pleasure to call on our first speaker, Professor Karen Froud.
Thank you, President Fuhrman, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. How's Academic Festival so far? Feeling festive? Excellent. Let's see if we can keep that going. Okay, so the title of this talk in your program is The Brain, I think. But then they told me I had 12 minutes. So I panicked a little bit and I narrowed things down. So instead we're going to talk about some of the research that we're engaged in here at Teachers College within the educational neuroscience field. Now, I'm here representing the two programs that I'm directly involved with. That is Neuroscience and Education and the program in Speech-Language Pathology. So for me, that's a great combination. I'm a speech-language pathologist who then got a PhD in theoretical linguistics and trained postdoctorally in neurosciences. So I'm going to try and convince you that that's an interesting and hopefully even useful combination. And also try and tell you how Teachers College is uniquely positioned to contribute to this relatively new intersection that we're calling educational neuroscience. Now, in fact, as you know, TC's been a leader in education for the past 125 years. I'm guessing it's been mentioned a couple of times so far today that, right, there's this anniversary going on. So one of our founders, Nicholas Murray Butler, was one of the first people who really emphasized that this scientific approach is necessary for understanding human development and human learning. There's been a program in neuroscience and education here at TC for over 30 years. So when President Fuhrman was mentioning firsts, I'm not sure that one was on the list, which I know is really, really long. But this, the fact that TC was the first place to have a program combining neuroscience and education really makes it, first of all, the oldest program of its kind in the country. And it stems from this perspective that science is so crucial for understanding human development. It's really built into the bricks and mortar at Teachers College. So my lab is the Neurocognition of Language lab. It almost fits on the screen there. Need a bigger screen for next year. And this, for me, this is an example of how TC really embodies that emphasis on taking this scientific approach. We have what we call a high-density electroencephalography facility, and it's right here. It's in the next building over, actually. There we carry out research into human language and learning and literacy and pathology across the lifespan. Now, many other colleges of education do have access to labs that are similar to this or that use related brain imaging techniques. But TC is unique because we are still the only school of education to have incorporated brain imaging research right here on site that's dedicated to the multidisciplinary work, speaks directly to education and clinical work. I'm fond of telling my students, you know, in most labs you work in, you have to do the research and then figure out how what you've learned can be translated into information that's useful for teachers or speech pathologists or psychologists, policymakers, and so on. But in our lab, the translation is the base. We start and end with these questions that are important for people working in classrooms, in clinics, in the local community, and the global community more broadly. Now, oh, there we are. Need to be a little more patient. So people who work in education, teachers, psychologists, researchers, they've been doing amazing work for decades, even centuries now. And we've learned a lot about learning. Neuroscience really hasn't been even part of that picture until relatively recently. So one question I often get asked is, why should we pay attention to this? Why neuroscience? Why educational neuroscience? Well, I'd like to point out in response to that anytime we want to understand something about learning, we have to understand something about the brain. You know, the brain is the source of all our behavior, all our experience, everything that we are. And we know by now this is not a one-way process. The brain is not a passive receptor of information. Brain imaging studies have shown us that even when we're processing even very simple kinds of sensory information, we're not doing that in a passive way. We're creating our own experiences from within, literally millisecond by millisecond. So taking in information, any kind of learning experience, is far from a one-way exchange. We need to understand how that works, how information is being processed as it's received, and what's the role of our own pre-existing experience as we learn and acquire new knowledge. But there's another part to this too. We do understand that some behaviors that we can observe on the surface are actually a lot more complex than they seem. So think about reading, for instance. That's something that a lot of us engage with often in classrooms, with children, with adults, in our own work, in our own everyday lives. It feels very seamless to us. If you see a word written down, you perceive that word, and it feels like instantaneously you understand what that means, right? So you see these squiggles on a page, C-A-T, and you immediately have a representation of a furry thing with sharp feet and fishy breath, right? Something like this. So we have to think about, even though that seems seamless, what is really happening when you show a child a written word and ask them to read it? Now, we can observe the behavior itself. We can see if the child reads the word or doesn't. If the child makes a mistake, if they try to read it but they get it wrong somehow, then that can tell us something about problems that the child might be having. But if we only look at the end result, at the behavior, we really can't see directly the relative contributions of all the different kinds of knowledge that go into reading. So for instance, the child has to know something about the sound systems, we say the phonology of their language. They have to know something about the words, the vocabulary of their language. The child has to know something about the writing system that is used in their community, and how to map between some set of visual symbols, they're really arbitrary visual marks on a page, and a set of sounds. And then once they've mapped onto a set of sounds, you have to build a word out of that set of sounds. And then once you have the word, you have to match that with a concept, right? Some idea of an object or an action that is encoded somehow in that word. The child also has to be able to do some other things, direct attention and sensory resources appropriately, has to be able to sequence speech sounds appropriately. And no doubt there are other steps in that process too. It seems very simple from the outside, but we know that there's a whole lot more to it. So if we only look at behavior, we miss a lot of information about the underlying processes that have to happen before that behavior can be observed. We might not understand things about why that behavior might be difficult for someone to learn, or why it's harder for some people than others. So technological advances in the past several years have meant that these kinds of questions are much more accessible now than they were before. We can use neuroscientific approaches to actually look at those underlying sub-processes rather than just examining behaviors. And let's be clear about why this is useful. If we can learn more about how people learn, we can better inform our pedagogical approaches. We can help to provide teachers with tools for more effective teaching, and clinicians with more effective tools for intervention. We can begin to evaluate our educational and clinical approaches at a much more fine-grained level of detail and with greater objectivity. And this applies not just in classrooms, but to learning across the lifespan. So let me just take a couple of moments to explain something about how we do this. Actually, there are many different methods, but the one I'll describe here is just one way of doing it. We call it the event-related potential approach. Now, first of all, because we're measuring the communication between brain cells, basically that's carried out in the form of tiny electrical currents. So we place very sensitive electrodes on the head, right? That's what you can see here. Then, because we're interested in how people process information that they're perceiving, we have a computer that can present stimuli or information to our participant. Now, we have to do this by computer because, remember, we're concerned here with how very rapid brain processes unfold. If we're going to know exactly when something happened in the brain, we have to know exactly when something happened in the environment, when the person heard a sound or when they saw a word, something like this. So for this method, we can't do things like showing someone a picture or holding up a flashcard or something like that, because we need to know to the millisecond when something took place. So all this has to be done by computer, and the computers are twitchy, right? They need to have very fine timing. They need to be carefully taken care of so they can do that. Okay, so the electrodes on the scalp are then connected to an amplifier, which is coming right up, I'm sure. There it is. This is the really important piece of electronic equipment that we need, because the signals we're recording are so very, very small. The amplifier actually has to be really specialized and really sensitive. That's the most expensive and important part of our setup, right? Well, except for the brain that's in here. Okay, so let's be clear. Then the amplifier is connected to a computer that records the data about the electrical fields that are being generated. And you can see here just a little example to show you. Right, see each of these little wiggly lines that's showing up? These wiggles just show changes in the relative voltage over each brain region. So each one of these electrodes is showing you how the voltages are changing in that part of the brain. Okay, well, after we've recorded the data, we have to do some more things to it to get some information out. Because in this data stream, we have information that we're interested in, like how the brain processes words, for example. But we also have information in there about how the brain does everything else that it's doing all the time, right? Like it's maintaining your heartbeat and your blood pressure, homeostasis. We don't want it to stop doing that, right? It's also thinking about, you know, how long is this person going to go on about this stuff, and when are we getting to the next thing, or I wonder if there'll be cocktails later, or something like this, right? Well, if you're me, that's what it's concerned with. So, so we actually want to kind of subtract out that kind of background information and really focus on what we're interested in. So we average together segments of data, and that's what then gives us the event-related information, right? The activity that's related to the stimulus that we presented, for instance. So what's interesting and useful about this approach is that it gives us information not just about where in the brain something happens, but also about how that unfolds over time. So we can map from these electrodes on the outside of the head to what's happening in the brain itself. This little example has been slowed down many, many times for you, and it really shows just the sequence of activity that happens when the brain is processing a word. Right, did you all catch that? So I'm not going to belabor the point too much. Basically, the idea is that it's a network, that if you just look at one point in time, you only see a snapshot. But the activation spreads and changes over time, and we need to understand more about how that network works together. That process, that video is actually 8 seconds long. The actual whole process really takes something like 200 or 300 milliseconds, right? So we slowed it down a lot. Okay, so now we have this little tiny glimpse into the methods that we use to do this work. Let me just tell you a little bit about research that's currently underway. I wanted to briefly outline the principles that we use to govern our research. We believe that neuroscientific investigations provide us with a way to objectively evaluate questions about learning and cognition. By looking at the brain, we can more accurately identify sub-processes that underpin complex behaviors. And then in turn, that can help us to target clinically or pedagogically what we need to do to be more effective teachers, more effective healthcare workers, more effective professionals. We draw on cross-disciplinary expertise. Neuroscientists, educators, psychologists, linguists, speech-language pathologists, and so on. Statisticians, engineers, mathematicians, musicians, dancers. We have all kinds of people working with us. And we conduct investigations that have the potential to inform clinical approaches, pedagogical approaches, to change educational policy, And perhaps what I'm most proud of, we do work that has an impact for issues of social justice and equality. I'm running out of time, but I'd like to just end by getting a little bit more specific so that you get a flavor of the kind of work that's happening here in the next generation at TC. We have, at the moment, so many projects underway that I had to pick and choose a little bit to let you know ones that I think are really relevant to the goals of the college more broadly and the global mission of Teachers College. So we're currently starting a project that's going to look at early language and literacy development in children who've participated in Head Start programs. There's a lot we want to understand about these early intervention kinds of programs, and by looking at involvement in Head Start and how that might change brain responses very early in development, we can start to understand how to frame some of those important questions. Things about how much involvement in such a program is really optimal, how long the effects might last through development, and what are the knock-on effects of Head Start intervention in terms of how well children function academically, socially, and so on. We've been looking also at early language development in really unusual sociolinguistic situations. The situation with Arabic is that everyone acquires what we call a colloquial variety at home in their family environment, but then education is conducted in what we call the standard variety of the language. So we hope that by examining how the brain is organized to support this situation, we can understand better the kinds of learning challenges faced by students who enter education that is carried out in a language different than the one they speak at home. Now, that's immediately relevant for situations like ELL, right? English language learners in schools, but also for people who have one kind of communication situation at home and then a different one in education. Children who are born deaf, for instance, or children who speak a non-standard variety of English, like African American vernacular English in the home, and then have to participate in education in what we call the standard English. We also have a project currently underway that's looking at how adults acquire reading skills. This is a very difficult skill to acquire later in life, and it's not really understood why it's so hard to learn and maintain. By looking at the brain responses of what we call adult neoliterates, we're beginning to understand that there's a large role for automaticity of processing. That basically, unless adults get enough exposure and practice, they simply never learn to do this reading task fast enough and automatically enough to make it really practical for them. So this has large social justice implications too, if we can figure out the best mechanism to support that kind of learning. Okay, this is a really challenging research program. We're at the cutting edge of work that has enormous potential for future benefits. So, for example, we want to be able to enhance our ability to evaluate the effectiveness of our interventions, to compare different kinds of intervention approaches we might take, and to identify earlier and earlier those people who could benefit the most from those interventions. I was going to end with a very concrete example for you. This is something that was published recently by myself and my colleague who's here with us today, Professor Khamis Dakwar. Childhood apraxia of speech is, from a clinical perspective, something that's been very challenging for us to work with over the years. It's a speech sound disorder where children basically have problems producing the sounds in their language. It was always thought to be a problem with motor movement, and so we would treat children to encourage them to be able to produce those movements more accurately. For some reason that we never understood, it was always very difficult for children to acquire those skills, hard for them to get better. The therapy really didn't seem to be working, and it's been a long time that we've been trying to work with this. So in the past couple of years, we ran a study in my lab that looked at how children's brains are processing speech sounds even when they're not trying to talk. And children who have this condition actually also have a problem in perception of speech sounds. So now we know that. We couldn't tell it from the behavior. We didn't know that. And so we were treating it in maybe not the most optimal way. Now we can begin to take steps towards changing our therapy approaches and addressing this much more effectively for those children. And that's just an example from, one of the fields that we're working in. Okay, that was super fast, and I hope I didn't go over your timing too much, but thank you all very much for your attention. I want to thank all of the members of my lab who make this work possible, and enjoy the rest of Academic Festival. Thanks for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Lisa Miller.
Hi, welcome. Most of all, our beloved alums, welcome back. And our newly admitted students, we're so delighted you're here. And we look forward, we are sure to coming to love you as much as we love our alumni. As much as you are from all over the world and all sorts of healers, teachers, and leaders, in the past decade, I've come to see that there is indeed a certain type of TC student. One with an adventurous, open, and innovative mind brought to service. Very often, service for those who have the least. And in fact, that quality from our students and our alumni and our faculty and our leaders mark the great energy and the great life of TC. We listen to our clients, our students are our teachers, and that in turn informs our research, which governs new practice brought back to our clients and students. It's this wheel of innovation at TC in which each of you participate. And as a faculty member, it makes coming here so delightful. I'm going to share with you, within our area of clinical psychology, one area of innovation, which is spirituality in wellness, healing, and mental health. In the spirit of the wheel, about 15 years ago, an 8th grade girl came to me. She brought herself to treatment, which is very uncommon for an 8th grade girl. And she'd come in great sorrow. To this day, it brings me pain. She'd lost her father. He'd been murdered. He'd been murdered by gunpoint at the deli where he worked. And she now had no one, absolutely no one. And yet, she knew that life could be better, and she knew that she was now in charge of her own destiny. So she brought herself to treatment, and very gradually, each week, we worked on how she could make her way. How, from a world in which she had now only left a substance-abusing mom, how, in a world where she would lock herself in her room to be safe, she could come to go out into the world and start to make friendships and find the type of mentors and governing teachers and spirits of generous adults who could help her make her way. And as we worked through this, we developed a partnership where she would make relationships. She would find her aunt's brother's girlfriend as a guide. She would find a teacher at her middle school as a guide. And we made headway. I'd say we went from about, out of 10, 2 to 6. But we got stuck at 6 for a while. And still she came, and still I sat there so much wanting her to go beyond a 6 in her young life. Until one day, she literally came skipping into session, and she said, "You're never going to believe this. You're never going to believe this." And I said, "Well, what happened? Please tell me." I went to a party. It was the first party I've been to. My sister's brother's uncle took me so I could go. And I said, "Well, what happened at the party?" And she said, "Well, a boy came up to me, and for the first time, I talked to a boy, and I said, 'What is your name?' And guess what his name was? Guess what his name was?" And I said, I don't know. She said, "His name was Elvis." And I said, "Elvis?" And I held the silence. And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Well, that was my father's name. Don't you see? God sent him. My dad is watching over me." And everything changed. She went from 6 to 9.5 to 10. Because she was now in relationship with a loving, guiding universe. And it was that understanding that made her capable of going forward and making friends and engaging in school and coming outside of her room and finding mentors other than her substance-abusing mom. That story was probably one of the most meaningful clinical experiences of my career. And yet when I went into the literature to read about spiritually informed treatments for young kids, for teens, for 8th grade girls at very high risk, there was nothing. There was nothing that explained what a spiritually informed treatment would look like. There was nothing in the scientific literature that explained the role of spirituality in risk and resilience and prevention and treatment. And so it was very clear, the knock at the door couldn't have been louder, that that was the work ahead. So with that in mind, and the wheel of TC, we set about in my lab a decade-long research program looking at spirituality as an untapped source of resilience in youth. And along with fellow labs across the country, as that beautiful girl had shown us that day, spirituality is indeed one of the most robust forms of resilience known to the medical, psychological, and broadly put social science literature. Kids who have a strong personal sense of relationship, just as Ariella had that day expressed, a personal sense of relationship with the creator of the universe, are 50% protected against substance dependence and abuse going through the window of risk, the second decade. Kids who have a personal sense of relationship, a personal spiritual relationship, such as Ariella expressed, are 80% protected against severe major depression, even when they come from families at high genetic risk. Kids with that personal spiritual relationship are more persistent, more resilient socially, and do better academically. There's a whole host. In fact, the effect is so broad and robust that it appeared to be crucial for basic science, in turn practice, and education to embrace and do better academically. There's a whole host. In fact, the effect is so broad and robust that it appeared to be crucial for basic science, in turn practice, and education to embrace this extraordinary untapped research. So, we set to work. And forward. Yes. Developed here at Teachers College a lab, a series of pedagogical opportunities, and a new host of treatments that are informed by spirituality. And while we find these to be helpful to many, many people, our chief concern has always been youth at risk, youth in poverty, youth like Ariella. Now, one of the major critiques as we went along was that, yes, that's very extraordinary, yes, that's very interesting that spirituality is so robust, but I don't believe it till I see it in the brain. So we welcomed our critics. We invited the skeptics to the table, and we looked for these extraordinary protective effects of 50% and 80% protective effect against the most prevalent forms of pathology at the level of the brain. And indeed, we found that in folks my age, 40-something, who since adolescence have had a strong personal spirituality, at the level of the brain exist broad and pervasive regions of thickening in the cortex, which otherwise would have shown thinning, given risk, heritable risk within the family for depression. We then looked, much like Dr. Froud, at not just what the brain looks like structurally, but how the brain works and what it gives off. So using EEG, as you just learned about, we found that people for whom there was a strong lead foot, a strong personal sense of spirituality, those people, when you simply say, come on in, have a seat, and close your eyes and relax, those people have a brain that's giving off the same wavelength, high amplitude alpha, that's found in monks as they meditate. And these are normal folks, civilians, right, who have a personal, strong sense of spirituality. Their brains, when you say, have a seat and relax, give off high amplitude alpha, much like that of a meditating monk. Now, spirituality, obviously, for each and every one of us, takes on a different form and a different practice. For some people, it's in nature. For some people, it's through deep prayer. For some people, there's a sense of adoration. Your own spiritual practice is unique to you, right? And it can exist for many people within religion, and it can exist for many people outside of religion. Yet, this body of work shows that it is foundational to our nature, that spirituality is part of our very makeup from birth onward. What's some corroborating data? If you look at twin studies, twins raised together, twins raised apart, you find that personal spirituality is about 30% attributed to heritability. 20% to how you were raised in your family, and the rest to your unique journey in life, unique environment. If you look at us in the second decade, that heritable contribution surges. It increases by 50%. So given the foundational nature of spirituality and its clear implications for wellness, we set up the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute here at TC in the spirit of each of you, open-minded, innovative, and healing. And we built, from a very cross-cultural perspective, and from a strong, scientifically based foundation, a strong pedagogical arc of training for master's students and doctoral students, and we started innovating and offering treatment to kids at high risk, which included personal spirituality in its many forms. And this work made a great deal of sense to the kids. So much so that we found over time, these are our kids at Covenant House, that it was the spiritual piece, first and foremost, that they found to be transformative. So the scientifically based new forms of treatment into which we train our students, if they so wish, the opportunities we can now give our students, have constellated in, as President Fuhrman said, the first Ivy League graduate program, which includes a concentration in spirituality. And as much as our students seem to love this and benefit, I'm so grateful that the girls like Ariella do too. Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful to share. Yeah.
Please welcome Professor Chris Emdin.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Your energy is a little low. I hope you hype it up just a tad. You know, I was debating whether or not I was going to do this, but just for the interest of getting the energy going, I'll perform for you before I share my research, all right? That was not in the plan, all right? So really quickly, I'll give you, my favorite, my go-to Newton's Laws of Motion rap, right? It starts off with, I'm a physicist / lyricist, I smash ignorance, it's a miss when I'm spitting this. See, Newton's laws of motion is the topic of the course because things in motion stay in motion unless they hit an unbalanced force. Well, next up's the second law of situation and summation force equals mass times acceleration. That's the second law that Newton foresaw, so if you want more, then the third law is in store. So every force has an opposite force and every action has an equal plus opposite reaction. The sum of all objects at rest is zero unless the object is no longer relaxing. I mean in motion, that's change in location, till it hits traction, a coefficient of friction. Then it all comes to a full stop, and there goes Newton laws over hip-hop. But hold up, I'm off Newton. I'm on an Einstein. I like Einstein because Einstein's mind is like mine. His formula was E equals MC squared, which is weird because me is your favorite MC squared. All right? So with that being said, the energy is different now, and I'll begin my talk. One of my heroes, who is most affiliated with Teachers College, is John Dewey. And I'll just read a quote from Dewey really quickly. And the quote is, "The path of least resistance and least trouble is a mental rut already made. It requires troublesome work to undertake the alteration of old beliefs." Troublesome work. The second quote is from another one of my heroes, Alexis de Tocqueville. And it says, "I cannot help fearing that men may reach a point where they look on every new theory as a danger, every innovation as a toilsome trouble, every social advance as a first step towards revolution, and that they may, in response, absolutely refuse to move at all." And those two quotes guide my research into hip-hop education and to connecting hip-hop education to science. Some of you have seen some variation of this sign. The one you're most accustomed to probably says parental advisory, explicit lyrics. And when you see that, it's oftentimes on the cover of a rap album or a rap CD, and oftentimes it means, for parents, stay away. And what happens then is that those who consume the album or the record that come with that sticker on it are perceived to have the same characteristics of the CD. And so the producer of it is providing this content they may not necessarily be edifying, and therefore the perception is that those who consume said artifact are also perpetuating this notion of not engaging in edifying practices. The reality then is that in the spirit of Dewey, that we have to look for the troublesome practices. We have to look for the toilsome work. We have to actually go and try to embrace the work that are oftentimes perceived to be where there's nothing edifying in it, where there's no academic content. And in that, we talk about this notion of hip-hop ed. And hip-hop ed is a phrase that we've coined. We can add that to the first at TC. And hip-hop ed is taking this notion of hip-hop and education and transforming that into educational practice in a way that goes beyond using rap lyrics in classrooms, but embracing the multiplicity of the culture of hip-hop. The movement, the art, the rap, the graffiti, the ways of knowing and being, the ways of dress, and identifying the fact that much of the young people who are pushed out of classrooms with the same fervor that they run out once they're pushed out, run towards hip-hop and hip-hop culture. And so the work is looking at hip-hop culture and looking at the academic principles within the practice and then going beyond the explicit lyrics into looking at what can we look here within this thing to connect to science. So we have this clip, and this is what you want to see in a traditional urban science classroom. And my work explicitly focuses on places where achievement gaps exist. And what you'll find in those spaces is that achievement gaps may exist in all disciplines. They actually triple or quadruple when it comes to science and mathematics. And usually we'll go into a classroom where youth will just say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to put on the goggles because it's not cool. I don't want to listen to what it is that you have to say. And so my work has been, what do I do to prepare the educators to be able to understand the nuances of hip-hop culture to engage young people, to get them to be willing to go on there, engage in the experiment, and get to going. And so for me, that meant really looking deeply, not only as hip-hop as we see it, but also tracing back the history of hip-hop culture. What I mean by that is, if you look at a hip-hop performer on stage, what is it about what he or she does that connects to the ways of knowing and being of African-American tradition that goes beyond what we name as hip-hop? And what you will then find is that the raising of voices at different points, the call and response, the use of the hand, the use of references to text and then back to the topic are found in the Black church. And so we've coined this phrase, Pentecostal pedagogy. In essence, if you go into the best Black churches, the Pentecostal churches, the modes of engagement of the preacher with the audience, in essence, are best pedagogical practice. The pauses, the references to text, and what hip-hop has been able to do, because what you'll find in most hip-hop artists is that many of them were born and raised in the church, is take the best out of what happens in the church and bring that into this realm. And so if those hip-hop performers are able to take these traditions from the Pentecostal churches and use that as a part of their practice, we are training our teachers to be able to look at these artifacts to improve their practice. So in my classes, our students will look at a performance of a rapper, but at the same time look at the performance of a Black preacher in the church and look at what they may glean from those practices to change and transform their practice so they can connect back to young people. This notion has then sort of evolved to look at existent literature by Gloria Ladson-Billings and other iconic educators who look at this notion of culturally relevant pedagogy, and some will look like culturally responsive pedagogy. And there's also this notion of critical pedagogy. And the powerful thing about those notions is that they get us to a point where we understand that we have to value youth culture, except we come through the filter of the educator. In essence, if I came to a classroom and I taught you and I said, be culturally relevant when you're going into these spaces, you're saying, okay, fine, I'm going to focus on youth culture. But that theory stops short because you are then taking your perception of youth culture to teach them. And through that filter of self, it no longer becomes culturally relevant. So in addition to Pentecostal pedagogy, we're moving towards the theory that's the basis of much of my current research and the research of my graduate students, which is reality pedagogy. In essence, focusing on the reality of youth experiences to be able to utilize that to inform your practice as it's informed by Pentecostal pedagogy. You still with me? So now that we've got that as a sort of theoretical underpinning of the work, we start delving into the classes here at TC, which I would argue what we're doing with our classes here is taking existing courses and reframing them completely, but also creating new courses in ways that the world of education has not seen before. For the past 4 semesters, I've taught a course called Hip Hop and the Cultural Studies of Science Education, looking at the spaces where hip hop is produced, and then bringing an ecological lens to looking at what the nuances or what the sciences are in those spaces as the examples for instruction. Beyond that, we're looking at hip-hop as going beyond rap, as many folks who have used hip-hop pedagogy does, and expanding that to include the other elements of hip-hop, which include graffiti, breakdancing, and DJing. Understanding that those who are the best DJs also have learned to manipulate technology in very nuanced ways. Those who do graffiti have learned to understand the body in very nuanced ways. And those folks, in essence then, are doing the work of what technologists would want to do. And how can our teachers, who we are preparing to go into urban spaces, be better informed if they understand all these aspects of hip-hop culture? I also teach an urban and multicultural science education class where we talk about what urban education is, but at the same time, we actually engage in deep practice of rappers on stage. Our students no longer look at urban education as the information we can get out of a textbook or a theory that's espoused by some theorist, eons ago. We actually go and the students actually capture video of rap performances and then model their instruction after the rap performer. But we don't stop there. We also then go and follow these teachers into the classrooms and see the extent to which they either mimic, not mock, or can replicate those practices and then measure the impact it has on the students' retention of the content. Next, we're also looking at this course that's been on the books at TC for a very long time called The Nature and Practices of Science, where we talk about the Eurocentric traditions of science education, how science initially began in the church and how these aspects of power play into how we construct what science is. We talk about the misogyny in science, the fact that Rosalind Franklin was silenced while Watson and Crick, got a Nobel Prize for their work in DNA. And when we start looking at those practices, we want to, in order to ensure that our teachers don't believe that this is just an aspect of hip-hop, we look at misogyny in hip-hop as well as misogyny in science. We look at forward thinking in hip-hop and also how it exists in science. We look at the formation of what the 5% religious sect in hip-hop culture and how they have tried to construct their own sciences. And then we try to expand that timeline of the 70s till today and overlap that with the timeline of the Enlightenment in science. And so we're creating these new philosophers, these new thinkers, and these new practitioners through a more robust look at hip-hop and science education. And in the spirit of Karen Froud, Yeah, I speak quickly, and so, my brain moves too quickly for these slides. In the spirit of Karen Froud, our most recent research is also looking at the neuroscience of this practice. In essence, some researchers at the National Institutes of Health actually did fMRI studies on rappers who were engaged in freestyle. And what they found is that the parts of the brain that controlled engagement, hyperactivity, and creativity were heightened when students were engaged or when these rappers were engaged in freestyle. At the same time, they found that parts of the brain that controlled appropriate behavior, what's deemed appropriate behavior, or sitting quietly, were deactivated when they were engaged in memorizing text, like what happens through the pedagogy of poverty in traditional classrooms. And so through this study of how the brains of rappers work, we start informing educators that if you really want to activate the more robust thinking of young people, then you have to use freestyle. And this is not just evidence-based because Chris Emdin said so, but we can find this as worthwhile if we explore youth culturally, if we look at the focus on science, but also neuroscientifically about how beautiful and wonderful this practice is. And in my last 30 seconds, we are also looking at this notion of science-mindedness, looking at all the practices, the most prolific scientists of our time. What made Einstein Einstein? This dude that imagined himself riding a light beam in outer space. What made Kukuli be as creative in developing the structure of aromatic compounds by imagining a snake biting his own tail? What we find in the most brilliant scientists of our time is that they were skeptics. They had keen observation. They were anti-authoritarian. They used evidence-based practices. They were curious. They were very analytical. And we looked at the population that exhibits the same characteristics in the artifacts they produce, and we also found them in rappers. And so right now we're doing a competition in schools in New York City where young people are creating raps based on science in 10 schools with a partnership with Jizza from the Wu-Tang Clan. And at the end of this event, which will be held here at TC, you will hear the most brilliant rappers, but also the most brilliant scientific minds of our time on stage, espousing their culture, but also speaking deeply about science. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Joey Lee.
Okay. Let's see. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. So exciting to be part of the Academic Festival 2013. So today I'd like to start by asking a question. The question is, how many of you guys here play games regularly? Okay, keep your hands raised, okay. How many of you guys have ever played games about violence against women? Okay, a lot of the hands dropped way down, okay. So I'm gonna talk to you today about designing games, and not just for entertainment, but designing games to address some of the biggest problems that we're facing today in the world, okay? And so some quick facts. The games industry is a $50 billion industry. It's actually more than twice the entire music industry. 97% of teens play video games, according to a Pew Internet Research study. And surprisingly, there are actually more women between the ages of 18 and 35 who play games than boys. Bet you didn't know that. All right. So while games had a very humble beginning, anybody remember the Atari 2600? Back in the day, games really didn't do a whole lot much more than simulate really bad tennis, things like this. But over time, games became much more social, much more sophisticated, and as the technology advanced, so did the ability to create games that actually could serve much more meaningful purposes. And so now, researchers, academics, nonprofits, even Al Gore cares a lot about using games to address real-world problems. So games are now being used to address things like fitness and health. Anybody ever play a mobile game to actually encourage you to run more, like Nike Plus or Runkeeper? Okay. Games are increasingly very, very popular for education and training. Games, for instance, medical simulation training games where prospective doctors can practice on bodies, and if they make mistakes, nobody dies, which is good. Games raise awareness of things like violence against women globally. A great new game called Half the Sky, where as you play things and earn virtual kinds of rewards, they actually make donations and impact people in the real world, in Africa and all around the world. And also games can be used to spark new interest in STEM. I'll show you some examples. What I'd like to do in this talk is talk about how the Games Research Lab, how we address some of the biggest challenges that we find in the world today. And so many of you who play games know that games have what are known as bosses, right? A boss level or something really big challenge at the end of the game. Right? And so for me, some of the biggest challenges that we face in the world today include motivation and engagement in classrooms, especially with dropout rates the way that they are today. Preparing students for tomorrow's jobs, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly. And then finally, climate change and sustainability. With dwindling resources in the world and other things that maybe even threaten our survival, how do we deal with these kinds of really major issues? And so I want to start with an observation, and that's regarding motivation and education. Learning has really shifted dramatically, right? So in the past, say this with this picture here of a silk factory in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, the goal once upon a time was really to mass produce assembly line workers, and really to kind of mass produce in a cookie cutter kind of way, generate workers with one kind of skill, one skill that could be useful for the particular tasks of that time period. But today, learning looks very different. Learning is really about exploration. It's about experimentation. It's about tinkering. It's about making things. It's about connecting with the rest of the world. It's about taking on more of this entrepreneurial mindset. It's about building things. It's about understanding systems and processes. So it's less about regurgitating facts. It's really more about doing and making things and using skills that actually matter today in the 21st century. And so the kinds of skills that I think we need to teach today are very different for today's digital age. We really need to train students to be more curious, to be more creative, to be more innovative, to be able to be much more comfortable with technology, and being able to work with people of other cultures and other kinds of other different places to understand systems. We also need students who are very self-directed, somebody who doesn't just do as they're told, but actually almost takes on more of this entrepreneurial learning mindset. And so in my work, I've really tackled three main questions. Number one, how can games be designed to change the world for good? So whether that's addressing problems like climate change or other kinds of problems. Secondly, what principles that are found within games can be applied to real-world problems? Can we actually extract the kinds of mechanics and dynamics and the kinds of mindsets and attitudes and behaviors that people do within games, take them outside of games, and apply them to real-world problems? And then finally, how can we use games to teach essential skills for the 21st century, the digital age, as I mentioned before. So I'd like to very briefly share with you 3 of the various game projects that the Games Research Lab is working on. They are in no particular order, actually in the order that I'm going to show you: Arctic Crisis, Greenify, and also Scholars Quest, the gamification of education project. All right, I'll begin with games for climate change education and sustainability. And with these particular games, I'm focusing on a few very challenging problems. Okay, and so how do we increase understanding of complex systems like climate change and sustainability? And how do we actually facilitate learning? How do we get people to actually want to learn about these issues, but also not just think of climate change as some problem, somebody else's problem, or some very complicated problem, but actually get people to take action and do something about this problem? And then finally, how do we increase empathy about these kinds of issues? So this is Arctic Crisis. It's a card game that's for 2 to 4 players, and it's all about teaching people about threats to Arctic ecosystems, predator-prey relationships, and things like this. And I'm sorry that didn't come out quite right, but the 21st century skills that this is targeting is systems thinking and empathy. So very quickly, the way this works is you're managing a part of an ecosystem. So you have a number of sea ice cards. All right, and explaining these games is a little bit like telling people what it's like to go on a roller coaster. So it's a lot more interesting than the description you're about to hear. But anyway, you receive sea ice cards, and then there's various animals that link up together that are supported by the sea ice. And so, for instance, in this case, the polar bear eats ringed seal, and so that's why we link up the cards like that. And the ringed seal will eat other cards like fish and so on. Now, various events will threaten Arctic species, for instance, industrialization or oil spills or other things that cause a loss of sea ice. And when this happens, certain animals end up perishing. All right, so in this case, let's say the ringed seal dies. And so the player has a sense of empathy or a sense of sadness whenever these animals die. And then furthermore, other animals that depend on that as a food source become threatened and endangered. And so it puts this task of trying to protect animals and trying to protect the ecosystems in the hands of the players. And as they take positive actions, for instance, developing alternative energy or other steps to try to protect Arctic species, in this way, you get this experience that's very hard to deliver in any other kind of way. The second project that I'd like to very briefly talk about is the Greenify project. And this is a real-world action game and social network that relies on crowdsourcing and gamification mechanics to engage players. The 21st century skills that this project tries to, that it targets include creativity, leadership, collaboration, and problem solving. And again, this is a mobile experience. And essentially the goal of what we're trying to do with this project is to promote a positive vision of sustainability. Rather than this doom and gloom message that is often heard, we are trying to convey this vision that sustainability is the possibility of all life flourishing together. And so again, rather than having people think of climate change or sustainability as something that they can't do anything about, how to make things a much more sustainable environment for their community. And so they come up with an idea, and then they'll actually create a mission. It'll fall within one of these 4 categories: home, food, outdoors, or the workplace. So it might be, oh, let's go eat organic on Thursday, or something along these lines, or go and let's clean up the park, or whatever it is. And they'll create a mission, and it shows up on their community, on the feed of the people who discover the missions. And so their friends or various people who are connected in this social network can receive that, and as they take action in the real world, they'll gain tree points as they complete this mission. And these tree points are tied in with social recognition, but also real-world rewards. Okay, I'm gonna have to go much quicker. So, gamification of education. So what are the properties that are found within games that are very useful and important for education, right? And so within games, you know, players of games spend thousands of hours, and it's like nothing. They'll even do very hard work, and they really enjoy it. So there's something about games that leads to the sense of persistence, this sense of optimism and risk-taking, and trying to solve problems together collaboratively and so on. These are all traits and mindsets that would be very valuable to transport into the school, right? And so how do we leverage these kinds of game principles to improve learning in the classroom? I'll have to go very quickly. And so there are several game mechanics that are very useful, game principles that are very useful for engaging learners. Some of these you can see here. So lighting the way to mastery. In my teaching, I actually taught a course where I gamified the course, where students started off with 0 experience points, and they chose a track, a designer track, a writing track, or a researcher track, and they completed missions. Some of them were optional missions. And as they completed these missions, they could gain experience points, and in this way, they would get a sense of progress as far as how they were pursuing and accomplishing various goals that would lead to the mastery of certain content areas. There's plenty of other principles here that I don't have time to talk about, including learning through failure, making the use of social power, and also rewarding and recognizing effort and process, not just performance. And so we've implemented this along with Chris Emdin. We've developed a series of a game layer toolkit for teachers called Science City Heroes. And the idea is to promote science-mindedness. And these are aligned with standards for science. And these science victory cards teachers can apply to try to change the culture of the classroom. So it's to cultivate creativity, persistence. Students can also award each other these like cards and peer awarded cards, et cetera. Now finally, there's a version of this for TC. For those of you who are new students who are here or new to the TC community, there's a website called scholarsquest.com. In scholarsquest.com, you can actually go there after the site. It's basically a game layer for TC that tries to take the tacit processes of how to be successful at TC and turn it into a game. And so we've asked faculty, we've asked people to come up with what are the traits and behaviors that you wish students did more of, and we turn them into game mechanics. There's actually quests. So for instance, if you want to learn how to get a great job, if you want to get more familiar with the maze of TC and things like this, you can learn from the advice of people who have actually developed some mastery or understand how things work around here, or you can also discover new research opportunities, et cetera. And you gain experience points as you complete different kinds of missions, as you gain skills in research, interpersonal skills, writing skills, teaching skills, service skills, and miscellaneous kinds of skills. As you complete those missions, you gain experience points, and there's a peer teaching and learning that takes place as this happens. And so there are various needs that are met through this kind of game layer. Finally, you've probably received a card. On the card, you have your secret mission. Okay, don't show anybody your secret mission. This is your secret mission. Now, with that secret mission, go ahead and, if you want to, go ahead and complete that mission. So do that real-world action. Take a photo of what you've done and post it on the Scholars Quest website. And in this way, we're trying to build up the community of TC and make it a much more vibrant place. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, right? Wow, the next generation. Thank you all. 2 very quick things because we're over time. Thank you, Rosella Garcia, for putting together this wonderful day. Second, you have to have a next generational setting to do all this next generational work. So please enjoy this video about our wonderful new classroom, and then please visit it. Also, 438 Horace Mann. Thank you. One of the big developments over the last couple of decades has been a greater understanding of how learning takes place. And understanding that enables a much more personalized approach to learning.
The beautiful part about incorporating technology into our teaching is that we can cater to different kinds of learning. So group discussions, presentations, group work, how the students ask questions, how they make mistakes. It's very exciting for me as an educator to see that, and I think it'll be very exciting for the students as well.
The prototype classroom for us is a way for us to create a laboratory, to be able to use it so that we can learn from them what works in the classroom, what doesn't work in the classroom, what kinds of technology, what kinds of environmental conditions are the most conducive to what they do.
One of the really wonderful things about Teachers College is its historic campus, and that really speaks to the past and the tradition, having a history of innovation and learning. But we also want to talk about the future, and we want to talk about how we balance the historic past with a really modern vision of the future and where the future is going in learning, which is really towards an edgeless classroom, a classroom without boundaries, and how can we talk about moving the education of Teachers College into this global stage.
Because you know that information on the web is at your fingertips to access, you start realizing as a teacher that you have an opportunity to connect with people from just way beyond the classroom, and that it's so easy to get them in.
We're learning more about learning itself. We're learning that we need to support knowledge building in our students. It's not a matter of transmitting. I know you don't, and I need to simply push content your way. It is a matter of us situating around particular big understandings, our learning, and using these tools to build our knowledge together.
I like the fact that there are these pods in the room where they can generate work and display it right away within their small group, but then display it on the big screen immediately as well. So less time lecturing, more time code discovering, co-creating.
We're moving away from this industrial revolution kind of one-size-fits-all model of education and really more towards this much more adaptive, flexible mode of learning and of communication.
It provides the kind of technological tools that we need to continue to explore teaching and learning. But I think it's also a symbol for the college of how we're moving forward into the future.
I mean, we've heard of smartphones, but this is a smart room, you know, imagine how it'd be with technology all around the place where you have all these big screens staring at you and you can interact with them, you know, they're touch sensitive, and that's pretty fascinating.
Since the room is wired for the internet and that it's all right here at our disposal, it's like having an art studio, that the materials are here on the table for us to play with and for us to experiment with.
What I love most is its flexibility. I really like how you can change the shares and change the tables and how you can show your work from the notes you took on the table, which is really amazing, as well as creating an environment where we have to sit down and learn content in a different way.
The touch panels, we're able to draw things and to capture that and save that for later. This new way of being able to preserve the knowledge that's created during class, I think is very important. We need more classrooms like this because we need to be increasingly agile and flexible to the changing landscape of learning technologies.
Teachers college graduates are leaders, and they need to have experienced some of this kind of learning for themselves so that they can go out and help build the learning environments for the 21st century.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Coffee is available on the mezzanine level, one flight up.